You know, Metallica are great. You might think that statement is slightly redundant, and it is. Being the highest selling metal band of all time, the quality of at least half their output is ubiquitous in most music circles, even if you don't like heavier music. But there's nearly always a lot of hostility directed towards them, especially in the metal community, for just about any reason you can think of. For supposedly selling out, for the radical changes of their sound, the Napster debacle, or even just cutting their hair. And this is shit that doesn't even have anything to do with the actual quality of their output. That's a whole nother kettle of fish. The almost constant changing of their sound, from thrash to commercial metal to alternative to post-grunge to country to hard rock to symphonic metal to nu metal back to thrash and even experimental music. This band gives David Bowie a run for his money in terms of changing their style. And did they sell out? Maybe? I don't know, I can't say. I'll let you guys argue this one out in the comments. And Metallica are the entry level of entry level bands in metal. And that's for good reason. They're an amazing introduction for the genre to those uninitiated. They're incredibly easy to get into, which makes them a great gateway band. I'll be willing to bet a good portion of those watching are probably introduced to metal and harder styles of music by these guys. And while not my favorite metal band of all time, they, along with bands like Black Sabbath and Judas Priest, helped create the bedrock of heavy metal. And whenever I see a self-professed metalhead say they hate Metallica, I always have to do a double take and wonder about other reasons they might say such a thing, other than actually hating their output. And to be fair, there's valid reasons to not like one or more members of this band. But they're Metallica, they're legends, who are definitely responsible for more positive in this world than negative. I remember when I was about 9 or 10, I went to my dad's house, and he had the Metallica DVD that had all the videos, and at this point, I was aware of the band, but hadn't heard much of their music barring a really bad quality bootleg live album my mother for some reason put on my iPod. And when I heard songs like One, Sad But True, and The Unforgiven, I was floored. And even though it ended on a really sour note with shit like I Disappear and stuff from Saint Anger, I had found my new favorite band. Until I got into Megadeth a few years later, but hey, that was a good few years. I saw them live on the Death Magnetic tour, I had Guitar Hero Metallica and played it religiously, and I tried my best to downpick all the Metallica riffs that came my way with my wimpy little child hands. They're one of the building block bands for me who really define my taste in music, and that's something I'll never forget. But anyway, let's get into the ranking. As always, this is merely just my opinion, no one else's, so instead of getting mad at me in the comments, leave your own ranking list down below and I can get mad at you for once. Also, Lulu won't be on this ranking because, number 1, it's a collaboration record, 2, everyone's already destroyed this album on the internet and I would rather not add to it, 3, we all know it would be on the bottom anyway, and 4, I've yet to listen to it in its entirety because I'm kind of scared. But anyway, onto the list. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you enjoy the video. Okay, thanks, bye. Saints fucking Anger. My word. If I had my way, I would just avoid talking about this album because it's just been done to death. Search for Saints Anger Review on YouTube and you'll find enough people to repopulate the planet. And I have nothing really to add to the conversation. The lack of guitar solos is dated and the riffs aren't good enough in its absence. James's voice is grating for much of the running length. The lyrics are heinous, the production is garbage, and they have no excuse for it to sound this bad. They worked on this album on and off for like 3 years with an ungodly amount of money thrown into the budget. I have friends in independent bands who've made better sounding albums in a fraction of the time it took for this album on a fraction of the recording budget. And of course, that snare. Whoever's idea it was to unclip the snare needs to be fired. Huh.
Rock and roll? Saint Anger. That's simple.
The songs are also way too long. There's no reason for the title track to be 7.5 minutes. It's not progressive or even an epic. It's just verse, chorus, verse, bridge over and over again. It gets very boring very fast. Same thing goes for Some Kind of Monster. The only thing different from the single version and the version on the album is the version on the album has more repeats of the chorus and one tiny separate section that really goes nowhere. Also, songs like My World and Shoot Me Again are just plain funny.
Shoot me again, I ain't dead yet.
As for positives, surprisingly, there's a few. It's not completely worthless. It just mostly is. I like parts of Invisible Kid where James is doing more clean vocals. Sweet Amber is kind of interesting and out of the box a little bit. And The Unnamed Feeling is an okay song, if not a little whiny. I don't mind the length unlike a lot of other tracks, and there's some decent riffs here or there. But those shining lights are few and very far between. It's painful to get through. Some albums have a terrible reputation for a reason, and Saint's Anger is no exception. And from one extremely controversial Metallica record to another, Load represents a huge departure for the band. They were no longer metal. Their sound is now a weird mix of alternative, blues, and hard rock. And this was a band who had metal in their name. This is like Metal Church all of a sudden becoming a jazz ensemble. And I could see why so many felt betrayed by this. They completely dropped the genre they helped bring to the masses. They all cut their hair at the same time, they changed their logo, and they did this all very suddenly. You can see why it seems calculated and superficial. But does the music justify its shift in style? Not really. I won't say it's awful, there's some good stuff to be found. But it's very, very, very boring. The album is a real slog to get through, and it puts me to sleep. Most of it is very mid-tempo and never picks up, which is not what I want from Metallica. Songs like The House That Jack Built, Bleeding Me, and even Outlaw Torn are songs that people always point to as being the best songs from this era, but they all just test my patience to an uncomfortable degree. Songs like Ain't My Bitch and 2x4 are just irritating. Until It Sleeps has some cool lyrics and a nice creepy vibe, but it's just kind of boring overall. And Hero of the Day is just embarrassing. Dude, the Goo Goo Dolls could out-rock this. As for good tracks, there's a few. I really love King Nothing, mainly for the bass line more than anything. Mama Said is surprisingly nice and a wholesome piece of country, which is interesting because I don't like country at all. But I dig this one. Overall, it's not great, kinda bad in fact, but I'd be lying if I said it didn't have its moments. Yep, that's right. I like Reload better than Load. Now keep in mind that's not saying very much, they're about on par, but I think Reload's highlights are slightly better than Load's, though these albums share the same flaws, which makes sense. These albums were originally supposed to be one double album, and honestly I think they should have just left most of these songs on the cutting room floor and had a single album with the best of both albums. But what's done is done, and there are slightly better songs than this album overall, at least in my opinion. Devil's Dance is a good doomy song with some really nice riffs and a good performance from James, which is really creepy. I quite like The Unforgiven too. I feel it's a good continuation of the first one, and it works well as its own song and a sequel, though it doesn't have the same sense of bleak misery that the first one has. And Where the Wild Things Are is a really weird song, but it works better than it probably should. Those songs like Fuel and Memory Remains are just annoying and really stupid. I'm just saying it's bad when I like the Rocka Rocka Ali parody better.
Kirk is gay, Robert's gay, Lars is gay, but the gayest is James.
The Load and Reload albums mark an era of Metallica that is not looked upon as particularly good by either the band or the fans. It's very rare that they play any of these songs live apart from Fuel, and James even threw the other members under the bus a few years ago and blamed them for these albums, which I think is just James trying to shift the blame, but hey, you never know. Garage Inc. is a covers album, and it's par for the covers album course. It's not particularly amazing, but it's not heinous either. Just kinda there. The Discharge covers and Die Die My Darling are really good, and they're way better than anything from the punk covers album Slayer did a few years prior. The Merciful Fate medley is great as well, and It's Electric and Whiskey in the Jar are also enjoyable, but Turn the Page really just misses the point of the original. Same goes for Tuesday's Gone. The original is one of my favorite songs in the 70s, but the Metallica version is so boring and redundant. I don't care if you have all these special guests, it doesn't make the shitty cover any better. It's missing the piano solo, which is one of the best parts about the original Lynyrd Skynyrd classic. Sabracadabra just sounds like it's missing something, it doesn't have any oomph to it, and the cover of Astronomy is so pedestrian. It doesn't have the majesty of the BOC original, and they sucked everything good about it out of the song. Garage Inc. has some pretty damn good highlights, but the low lights are playing Limbo in hell. It's the definition of a mixed bag. Probably shouldn't have even fucking included this thing as a covers record. You know, Death Magnetic is not a bad album at all. Now this may be some nostalgia goggles stuff for me, because this was the current Metallica album from when I was first getting into the band, and I loved it at the time and I still enjoy it now, even though I am now very aware of this album's many flaws. It's very refreshing to hear the band do thrash again, even though they don't quite have the same power they used to. I like what Rob brought to the table musically. That guy has such a great presence in the band, and it's such a shame how underutilized he really is in Metallica. Go listen to Infectious Grooves or Suicidal and try and tell me that he isn't being held back. Songs like That Was Just Your Life and All Nightmare Long are really enjoyable, and my personal favorite is Broken Beat and Scarred. It's a classic Metallica to its core. But of course this album is infamous for having a heinously brick-walled production. Rick Rubin really did these guys dirty. The Rick Rubin who did Death Magnetic was not the same guy who did License to Ill or the early Slayer and Danzig records, I can tell you that much. But you can find the mixes of this album they did for Guitar Hero, and it sounds so much better when it isn't a victim of the loudness wars. As much as I enjoy the album for what it is, I really hate The Day That Never Comes because it's just so spineless and wimpy. I also dislike The Unforgiven 3 because I feel it's a real step down from Part 2 and especially Part 1. Most of it is real forgettable because it touches on the same subjects as the previous Unforgivens, though with that being said it does pick up a bit by the end. Overall, Death Magnetic is a solid yet uneven effort from the metal maestros.
We're so fucked. Shit out of luck.
I remember when Hardwired was coming out and everyone was super excited thanks to some pretty solid singles, but after it got released, I heard nothing at all.
Nothing at all. Nothing at all.
My guess for that was that the double album they recorded was just too much for most people to really care about, but God only knows. And that's right, we have another double album. But unlike something like Road and Reload, it's a much more concise listen, and it rarely drags. The album is barely over an hour, and only has 12, mostly longer than average tracks. And even though it's technically more of a time commitment than other Metallica records, it really doesn't feel like it. The album starts off very strong with the thrashing madness of tracks like Hardwired, Atlas Rise, and Moth into Flame, and the sludging sinister cuts like Now That We're Dead and Dream No More, which really pack a punch. But I feel the album kinda drops off by side 2. It's by no means bad, it's enjoyable enough, but most of the tracks don't have the same impact, and they don't stay with you like side 1 does. It kinda reminds me of some of the weaker Death Magnetic tracks. But the closer, Spit Out the Bone, makes side 2 all worth it, because it's the best track this band has done in many years. It sounds like the logical follow-up to songs like Blackened, but I can tell this is a far different version of the band. They've aged like a fine wine. Hardwired to Self-Destruct is by no means the best Metallica record, and I'd be lying if I said it was on par with shit from the 80s. And by the middle, you do start to feel its length a little bit, but with a great production, powerful performances, and a reinvigorated band as a whole, you have a worthy album to bear the band's name. I'd be willing to bet that you thought this album would be much higher. And don't take me as a Black Album hater by this album's relatively low spots, because I do love it. And from here on out, we have nothing but classic records. And this album is the epitome of classic. This album's got Enter Sandman, guys, come on. I know it's been played to hell and back, but it's still a monstrous song with one of Kirk's best riffs he ever wrote. The album in general sounds amazing thanks to Bob Rock's production. You can argue it sounds too clean and crisp, and that's an opinion I used to have as well. And on the lighter tracks you can definitely feel the gloss, but the production makes the heavy moments sound as huge as they are. They aren't lost to subpar sound quality like on some other albums. After Jason got shafted on Justice, he definitely makes his presence known on this album with a thick and juicy bottom end. It even has a few moments to shine like on My Friend of Misery. The Unforgiven sounds like a tidal wave of grief washing over you, and is definitely one of the band's best ballads. Sad But True is one of the most punishing songs of all time. The God That Failed spits pure vitriol, and A Wolf and Man is probably my favorite off the album just because of how catchy it is. Though I can't lie, I never liked Nothing Else Matters. It feels like the antithesis of what makes Metallica great. Though I'll be honest, that may be some of my biases speaking. Don't Tread on Me gets on my nerves with its use of the Star Spangled Banner, and it radiates huge No Step on Snake vibes. But the Black Album is a legendary record, and even some lame cuts can't ruin it. Out of the 4 thrash albums this band did in the 80s, And Justice for All is definitely the ugly stepchild. You'd be hard-pressed to find someone say this is their favorite Metallica album. It's not to say it's bad, because it's not, far from it, but it has the unenviable position to be compared to its predecessors. First off, its production is not good. The biggest issue is of course the bass, or lack thereof. You see, new bass player Jason Newsted's technique was very different to how Cliff played, and at the time was very similar to how James played rhythm guitar. So James's scooped sound took up a lot of the bass's frequencies, and during mixing, James and Lars made it even worse by squishing Jason's parts to dust, which in turn makes the guitar sound very thin because there's no bottom ends. Man, Jason got a raw deal, he deserved way better. But the songs, of course, slay. They may have lost Cliff, who was arguably their most important member, but they weren't the brash teenagers they were at the band's inception. The band had grown a lot as both musicians and people. I mean, on Kill 'Em All, they're writing cheesy songs about Satan, which I love too, don't get me wrong. But in Justice for All, we have songs about political corruption on the title track, James's toxic religious upbringing that killed his mother and alienated him from his father on Dyer's Eve. And you can hear the scorn in his voice. You can tell this is something he's kept bottled in for years. Of course, we have One, which is a monumental song about the story of Johnny Got His Gun, and Blackened as Riffs for Days that has lyrics that dive into nuclear war and climate change. But Frayed Ends of Sanity's Wizard of Oz bullshit really gets on my nerves. Also, To Live Is to Die leaves a lot to be desired as an instrumental. Overall, Injustice for All has its fair share of flaws, but it succeeds almost in spite of them. Kill 'Em All is thrash incarnate. It's hard to find an album more quintessential thrash than this, and it was by all accounts the first full-length thrash album ever. Sure, there's some songs that came out in the 70s you could arguably call thrash, like Symptom of the Universe from Sabbath, Judas Priest Exciter, or even Queen's Stone Cold Crazy. But all of those songs were one-offs, and they didn't have the same
Heavy crunch crunch
and intensity that Kill 'Em All had. As soon as Hit the Light starts, you knew this was not going to be just another metal record. It really was the beginning of a movement, and Metallica opened the floodgates. Highlights include Whiplash, a song that makes you feel as if you're getting whiplash. It's a song headbanging was made for. The Four Horsemen may not have the polish of later epics, but it makes up for that with pure aggression and riffs for days. You can definitely tell they were heavily influenced by punk and hardcore during this era. In fact, it's common knowledge that during the band's early days, that they were too punk for the metal clubs and too metal for the punk clubs. They were like a new Motorhead for the 80s, but with more distortion, and that's just awesome. And speaking of Motorhead, my favorite track has got to be Motor Breath. It's searing but not painful to listen to, catchy but not too poppy, and the riffs go 1,000 miles an hour. I swear, James's right hand must be made of steel. The Four Horsemen gets compared to Megadeth's Mechanics a lot since they're almost the same song, and while I love them both, I think the Four Horsemen has a bit more to offer in my opinion. Seek and Destroy has been played to death, but come on man, it's Seek and Destroy. It's a monumental song that, much like this album, decimates all within its path. The sophomore slump is a dreaded curse in music. Everyone from Dr. Dre to Guns N' Roses has suffered from it. No one's safe. And it makes sense if you spend all your life writing your first album and only have a matter of months to write your second. But Ride the Lightning is the opposite of sophomore slump. You could easily make the case that this is the best of the band's entire career. It took everything great about Kill 'Em All and improved upon it in almost every single way. With the introduction of Fight Fire with Fire and you hear that soft and pretty intro, you might think, man, Metallica's gone soft. But then you are treated to one of the most ferocious songs in all of thrash metal and something heavier than anything on their predecessor. For Whom the Bell Tolls may not be the fastest song the band ever made, but it's one of their most iconic. And it's pretty much all because of the bass. Cliff's siren-like bass solo at the start of the song is as legendary as Cliff is himself. It's to bass what Iron Man is to guitar, and the rest of the song ain't bad either. Call of Cthulhu is as majestic as the monster itself is, and it's probably my favorite Metallica instrumental. Creeping Death is about the 10 plagues sent to Egypt in the book of Exodus, so I guess it's Christian metal, but unlike Christian metal, it's actually, good. And Fade to Black might just be my favorite Metallica song ever. It's simply put misery put to music. James started writing it after a bunch of their gear was stolen, and he took that sadness he was feeling and made one of the most soul-crushing songs of all time. It's a power ballad with heavy emphasis on the powerful parts, and Kirk's solo in the song is one of the best of all time. I know Kirk gets a lot of shits, and some of it's deserved, but on Fade to Black he delivered one of the most emotional and soaring guitar solos of all time, and you can't take that away from him. This is an album that's really hard to review because I feel like I'm stating the obvious. Everyone knows that this album's a masterpiece. You know it, I know it, the guy down the street knows it, we all know it. Right from the start of Battery, you understand the growth Metallica had in the few short years removed from Kill 'Em All. It still has the same fire and they're still hungry, but they're pushing their sound to a never-ending finish line. The songwriting is clear and precise as compared to the somewhat sloppy construction of songs they've done previously. The band had amazing chemistry with each other, with each person pulling their weight with amazing performances, even Lars, and the production is perfect. Master and Ride the Lightning are the two best sounding Metallica records by far. Nothing else they've ever done even comes close. It's crisp but not too crisp, it's raw but not too raw, it's the perfect middle ground between the underproduction of Kill 'Em All and the overproduction of Black and The Load and stuff. The Thing That Should Not Be is one of my personal favorites that has a spooky and almost doomy vibe, and has references to Lovecraftian monsters that I believe Chris was a big fan of, and he turned the rest of the band onto as well. Orion is a triumphant instrumental that is catchier than most songs with vocals. Welcome Home Sanitarium is a really dark, twisted ballad about the film One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, and it paints a really dark image from Kirk's solos that are so somber to James's lyrics that are so demented. The title track is maybe the definitive Metallica song. It has everything great about them crammed into 8.5 minutes, and it's a roller coaster of a track about drug addiction. Damaged Inc. is maybe the angriest song they've ever done. It goes a million miles an hour, the band can barely keep up, but it hits the spot just right to end the record. It's a masterpiece in every sense of the word, and definitely the best Metallica album of all time. And that's my list. Do you agree? Disagree? Tell me below in the comments. Click here for more metal videos. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell to remain notified and support the channel. But anyways, take it easy, party people. The four... Fuck.